Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. Ian Allen Paul, whom you might remember from our episode called Our Prisons Computers, is back on the show today. We have been working closely with Ian over the past few weeks, preparing his newest book, The Reticular Society, on Zero Horizons, our series on zero books. However, the reason that we have him on the show today is to address a more urgent matter, which is the situation in Gaza and Palestine more broadly, and the ongoing extermination of the Palestinian people by the Israeli occupation. Ian has written a fantastic short piece entitled Between the Sea and the Security Fence, which has been published on Ill Will. And of course, we have linked Ian's writings in the show notes. Between the Sea and the Security Fence addresses the cold blanket of social technologies, surveillance apparatuses, and other methods of control which have smothered the lives of the people of Gaza. And, as Ian writes, have forced Palestinians to live and die as an abstraction. The coupling of Ian's research on the politics of the control society and his experience on the ground as a teacher in Palestine afford him a unique perspective on the conditions which have now mushroomed into a genocidal campaign intended to fulfill the ultimate plan of eradicating the Palestinian people. We hope that both Ian's personal and philosophical account on the show today can help us to further amplify support for Palestinians in their ongoing struggle. Ian, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be on. I'm really looking forward to being able to talk with you all today.
Great. The first thing that I want to do is just get a general picture of your experience of having lived and worked in Palestine. I just did an interview with Nicola Tajan in Japan where we discussed teaching as expats. And I imagine that getting one's bearings in a place like Palestine entails some unique challenges and perhaps even joys. Could you talk about what led you to that particular teaching post? And what are some of the images that come up for you as you recollect your time there?
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of came at the culmination of my graduate work. So while I was doing my doctorate at UC Santa Cruz, I had done my dissertation on kind of the aftermath of the Egyptian Revolution and the subsequent military coup there. And so I had lived in Cairo for about a year and a half doing field work and was kind of culminating writing the dissertation at that point. And as I was finishing my doctorate, as one does when one tries to find one's way in academia, you just kind of apply to whatever positions you see are kind of available. My kind of research had not really been concerned or focused on Palestine, but growing up in California, I had been kind of tangentially involved in various kind of Palestine solidarity movements that had been active there. And I saw a position kind of pop up for a university in the West Bank, which it's technically in East Jerusalem. It's called Al-Quds University, but it's on the other side of the wall, so not kind of separated by the security barrier from Jerusalem itself. And so I applied and heard back that they were interested in me teaching there. And so after talking with my partner about the complexities of moving to Palestine and relocating there and teaching, we decided we wanted to do it, and we kind of made the trip. Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting experience, obviously, because having read quite a bit about Palestine and seen documentaries and stuff like that, you have a kind of image constructed in your head of what to expect and what the situation will be like. And having taught in Cairo, I was somewhat kind of used to kind of North African, Middle Eastern context, but obviously they're quite distinct in many different ways. But yeah, it was just really eye opening. I mean, on the most immediate kind of impression that was left upon me was this kind of contrast between the way in which everyday life feels very normal. You're just kind of walking around villages and going out for tea and meeting friends, and it feels like any other place in the world, just like very calm and relaxed. But then, of course, in the background, there's this kind of constant hum of state violence, which just kind of always reverberates. Driving between towns, you cross through checkpoints, and so you can't avoid it. Just kind of moving around and exploring where you live. when we were teaching at the university, it was very often that IDF patrols would like come and just kind of park in front of the university and kind of wait for, students to come pick a fight essentially. So, they would just kind of create these situations in which inevitably violence would erupt, right? Um, so yeah, when I was living there in 2016, 2017 and teaching at the university, it was a period of fairly low intensity in terms of kind of social unrest. Like there were protests and demonstrations and everything that would occur in the West Bank while we were living there, but it wasn't obviously anything like what we're seeing today. But nonetheless, the violence was very present in my students' lives, obviously. Speaking kind of subjectively about my own individual experience, I mean, obviously, as an American, someone with an American passport, as a professor, as someone that presents as white, you get a special kind of treatment from the IDF and the Israelis. I mean, obviously, they were very, very kind of confused and interested and suspicious of kind of what I was doing there, and were always kind of keeping tabs and particularly kind of coming in and out of the country. That I think I talked a little bit about this the last time I was on. That that part of kind of the apparatus is in full effect. But obviously, they really want to avoid a situation where they're seen as kind of targeting Westerners or targeting professors or things like that. So you're given a degree of privilege. But nonetheless, these kind of quotidian forms of the occupation persisted, right? Just like every morning, we were living in Bethlehem, so we would take a shared bus between Bethlehem and Abu Dis, where the university is. It's about half an hour in a tiny bus, but as you kind of go through one of the valleys that separates the towns, you pass through one of the checkpoints. Sometimes the checkpoint would just be open, but more often than not, soldiers would be there and would stop the bus, and everyone would have to present their papers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it just gets kind of, again, inscribed into the way you think about your days and your planning and how you're kind of relating to the place you live. I mean, I could go on and on, but maybe I'll stop there for the time being.
No, that's great. In fact, I mean, you're answering some of the questions that I had in advance. I guess what I would ask is, as a guest in a country, at least, for example, when I lived in Japan, certainly the political situation was nothing like living in Palestine, but I was always on guard, to make sure that, I stayed within, reasonably within certain norms as not to, kind of ruffle feathers or disrupt things and just, respect the local culture and so forth. I guess my question is, besides maybe the air of tension and antagonism that persisted, even though it was at a low point, historically, what were maybe some of the joys or affinities that you found while teaching in Palestine that maybe were rare or uncommon to other contexts in which you either lived or teached?
Yeah, I mean, it was an extraordinary experience, and in some ways, I'm a little bit, sad that I was only able to live there for a year because of various circumstances that arose. But yeah, I mean, the West Bank in particular, I was never able to visit Gaza, unfortunately, so I can't really speak to that. But in the West Bank, there's this kind of circulation of international solidarity activists, right? And so typically, the tourist visa that you get when you enter Israel is for a 3-month period. And so typically people come for these 3-month chunks and do kind of various solidarity work in the West Bank. Either they go and live in villages that are kind of under various forms of assault from settler communities in the West Bank that kind of provide international protection, or to do various forms of solidarity work in the refugee camps in the West Bank and things like this. And so there's this, I don't know, this real kind of sentiment of being part of a shared political project, a part of a shared political community, which is really beautiful and extraordinary. And also just encountering kind of the Palestinian kind of communities across the West Bank. You just get this kind of extraordinary open welcome. Like people just understand why you're there, and are really excited that you decided to go and kind of work there. And I don't think I've ever actually spent time in a place like that where there was, because of the conditions and because of the kind of understanding of the occupation and everything. Even though obviously myself and people I spent time with lived very different realities and have very different kind of personal histories. Um, there was, through the kind of shared commitments and shared kind of ethical frameworks, a kind of commonality which kind of describes, or which exceeds words in a lot of ways, I would say, and was just yeah, extraordinary. And of course, I mean, that's not even to say that the relationships that I was able to kind of develop with my students, which was profound and incredible. Not to be too cynical, but a lot of my experience teaching has felt quite utilitarian. That I feel like students often, in many university contexts, have this kind of relationship to their education, which is about what kind of job am I going to get when I graduate, and things like this. It's a very kind of very linked to economic thinking and stuff like that. But in teaching at a university in the West Bank, there's a real sense of kind of like trying to think together in a very radical way, which was just wonderful. And it's the reason that I was first drawn to kind of pursuing theory and philosophy and kind of higher education. And I don't know, it was just, there was a different way of thinking about what we were doing in the classroom that again was kind of rooted in this kind of ethical framework around what it meant to live in resistance to the kind of occupation, and think in resistance to the occupation as well. So yeah.
That's wonderful. I'll ask one more question before I pass it off to Adam or Will. Um, and maybe this will, kind of get us on course to talking about the piece that you wrote for Ill Will. Is there a singular image or memory that comes up for you when you think about the work that you do philosophically, theoretically, with respect to control society or philosophy in general, with respect to your teaching experience there? Maybe something that was burned in a little bit more deeply than other memories that you have.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just evoke a few very quickly. I mean, along with the kind of everyday banal things that happen, there are these kind of very bizarre like experiences you have as well. One that I remember, which again I think is a kind of quotidian experience in the West Bank, but for me was very bizarre. Was I very much remember kind of as this vignette of my time there, was kind of returning from the university one day in the bus at the end of a long day of teaching, and having the checkpoint being closed, right? So we could not pass through the checkpoint. It was kind of sealed shut. And it was kind of mysterious because there had been no protests or no conflict or anything like that. And so it's kind of unclear what was happening. And, when these checkpoints close, it causes huge traffic backups, because people are trying to get home from work or visit family or friends or whatever, a million different reasons for moving around. And it's just closed, right? It's just blocked. There's nothing you can do about it. And what became clear after kind of a while of kind of sitting in the heat, like in these buses, was that they were actually kind of training new guards for the checkpoint, right? So they had kind of sealed it, and you could see these kind of like young soldiers there, and they were kind of rehearsing the whole practice of kind of opening and closing the barriers and going in and out of the little kind of armored booths, and getting into certain kinds of security positions with their weapons and whatever. And so they were kind of rehearsing and simulating the whole security apparatus, right, for like a couple hours. So it's just kind of like this bizarre kind of theatrical performance that's going on for all of these Palestinians in the West Bank who are just trying to live their lives, and they're kind of caught in this rehearsal of their kind of repression, right? And so it's not, in that instance, right, there's not like a one-to-one kind of act of violence occurring, but it's merely just the kind of reproduction of the violence that's actually the act of violence in that instance. It's very Baudrillardian, right? It's like just the kind of rehearsal is actually what impinges upon the population in that instance. That's a memory that really sticks out. I mean, another one is, I was doing a lot of filming and photography when I was there, as a way of kind of thinking and exploring and kind of reflecting on my experiences. And I went to a few, protests in Bethlehem while I was there. And, there's this kind of tradition of doing these kind of weekly marches against various kinds of checkpoints at the edges of Bethlehem, near some of the refugee camps, and seeing, those people kind of go through that experience and the kind of courage that's required of doing that kind of that kind of public political action, also left a deep impression on me, because on the one hand, it's very kind of scripted, because because of how many times it's been done. There's kind of prayers that happen in the streets, and then people kind of march towards the checkpoints, and the kind of IDF comes out and starts shooting rubber bullets and tear gas, and it kind of goes back and forth, and people throw rocks, and it kind of goes on, right? But I don't know, just the refusal to just kind of let it exist and to continue to kind of resist it, and to organize with people across generations and across different parts of the West Bank, and just kind of have that be a part of how one understands what you're doing with your life and how you're committing yourself to a particular kind of historical project. That also really sticks with me, just the courage of kind of engaging and sticking to that kind of practice in that context where the violence is so extreme and the surveillance is so extreme, et cetera. So those are two that I would point out. There are many others, but yeah.
Great. Adam or Will?
One of the sort of the things that really sort of hits home what you're saying is particularly thinking about the solidarity, the organizational function of the university and of learning, precisely because, particularly in Gaza today, there are no universities anymore. They are gone. They are. It is, as I mean, the phrase, and I think you picked up on this in your piece quite well. It is indiscriminate bombardment, but it is meticulously indiscriminate. It is discriminating how indiscriminate it is, because it seemed indiscriminate in the sense of military tactic. They're not targeting targets, but they're also targeting very specific targets, because they have an incredible amount of surveillance throughout these areas. And this is why that's why they're targeting hospitals, why they're targeting paramedics, why they're targeting mosques, bakeries, universities, all of those particular community spaces. And it kind of shows, as we're actually ruminating a little bit on your discussion of sort of how the occupation forces were quite nicer to Westerners, almost curious about the fact. It actually reminds me of a similar experience that Ta-Nehisi Coates was talking about on Democracy Now! A couple of days ago. And it almost feels somewhat quaint, given the impunity with which the Israeli security apparatuses are functioning now. I mean, for example, recently, so a lot of UK nationals have been allowed out of the southern border crossing in Rafah. Irish nationals were not on the list, as a kind of another layer of collective punishment on nations that weren't exactly towed a line on endorsing this genocidal atrocity. But maybe just to stay with your experience before we move into the more sort of conceptual aspects of your piece, where would you think, so particularly I want to ask about the intrusion of security apparatuses, surveillance apparatuses into your work as a teacher, because you mentioned, of course, the IDF coming in and sort of waiting for someone to start a fight, but I want to sort of ask about how the structures of surveillance and control interfered, or rather structured, on ways in which you were teaching, ways in which you were organizing, and sort of your encounters with them, and you sort of seeing people getting caught in the coils of that control system.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I would answer that in two ways. I mean, first, speaking personally about my own experience, I mean, I think, at least kind of going in and out of Israel, and flying in and out of Tel Aviv, and having to go through, you have to go through a kind of preliminary interrogation before you kind of go through you go get your bags and things like this. They, what they really want is to kind of catch you on a technicality, right? They want you to catch you kind of lying or hiding something or whatever, because then they can very easily, they kind of deport you and say you're being deceptive, and et cetera, right? And so, in that context, because I, had a job with a university, and, had a PhD and was from the US, and there were all kinds of things in which, like, within this kind of politics of legitimation, you can kind of mobilize as a particular kind of subject in that context. I mean, that's what I did, right? You kind of go in and kind of I have no problem kind of exerting a particular kind of subjective authority in a situation where they're interrogating you, and you just kind of go in, and if they decide to deny you entry or deport you, that's their kind of PR problem, and that's the game they play, right? Is they want to appear democratic and committed to human rights and whatever, and so they have to kind of delicately balance how they relate to people like me when I go, right? And so, like I said, they always wanted to know what I was teaching, and why I decided to go teach there, and these kinds of questions. They never really asked about my students. Fortunately, that would have been something I wouldn't have been willing to talk to them about. But I think it's something I thought a lot about there because of my research, into digital surveillance and control, was precisely kind of how this was working in the territory. And I think it's really, I mean, one of the lessons that I drew from my time there, and I think is really key to kind of stress, is that there is this kind of mythology of like the totalitarian, all-knowing kind of security apparatus, right? That really knows everything that's going on and has delicate control over every situation, and subsumes all the population in its data sets, et cetera. And I mean, certainly there are massive surveillance apparatuses, right? But it's certainly not true that nothing escapes, right? I mean, this is like false, right? This is the game that's being played right now, in the public statements about how the Israeli state simultaneously kind of knows where every Hamas fighter is in Gaza, and is kind of doing these precision bombings and etc. But then at the same time was completely surprised by the Hamas attack, right? I mean, these two facts are like incompatible. They both cannot be true, right? And so so it's worth, I think, reflecting on the ways in which all of the discourse about the control society and cybernetics and all this kind of stuff, they operate primarily, I think, as kind of fantasies, right? That is a particular kind of projection of power, that certainly kind of has material consequences, but is never, without its exceptions and without its kind of turbulence and noise, et cetera. And this was, again, true in my kind of teaching experience with students and et cetera. The IDF occasionally would raid the campus and kind of break into people's offices and do searches and stuff like that. But I don't think that was really about collecting data or things like this. It's more about kind of creating the persistent sense of the occupation, or the persistent sense of being watched, and these kinds of things. And I definitely had students that were politically active and involved in various kind of political factions in the West Bank. And they obviously had to be very careful about any kind of political organizing they were doing, and et cetera. But there is continued very broad, widely kind of supported resistance movements in Gaza and the West Bank, obviously, that elude and escape these kinds of totalitarian mechanisms. So I'm not sure how well I answered your question, but that was my kind of impression of it.
No, it's completely correct to really emphasize the idea that, yes, we can think about these surveillance systems cybernetically, but a lot of cybernetics in the history of cybernetics has just been hype about what cybernetics might do in the future if we just keep feeding it the right data. And the map and territory distinction contra Baudrillard is fully in place, and if anything, that sort of sets the coordinates of this atrocity, because it is kind of what is colonialism other than a war of the map on the territory to try and subsume it, to try and sort of striate it according to all of the fences and grid lines and the like. And it's, I mean, absolutely, yeah. There's a temptation to move in sort of an anti-technological discourse, but I mean, I was reading this book. People can't see it because it's a podcast format, of course, but it's called Interviews of Radical Palestinian Women, and there's one interview in here about sort of from photo and video journalists, and if anything, it's shown sort of how much data capture, in a sense of photo and video capture, can be used to get this stuff out. It's not simply a war on biotechnology. It's ultimately a war between the use and abuse of technology for life, to take a sort of a Nietzschean phrase. And yeah, the seeming omnipotence of these services is completely belied by the fact that, one, Israel sort of has to export and sell some of these services, and some of these services had to be sold to Israel, and so the marketing luckily tends to let a lot of these things escape. I mean, even some of their facial recognition systems, like the Wolf Pack system, the Wolf Pack, the big database, the Red Wolf, the facial recognition scanners, and the Blue Wolf, which is basically a horrible version of Pokemon Go in which you basically gamify collecting people's faces to process them. You can collect all the data you want. If it's being read by let's to use a blunt sort of phrase, a completely ignorant racist who doesn't know his arse from his elbow, you're not going to be as enabled. This is apparently why they're losing the propaganda war as well, because it's AI making an AI image of Voldemort does not propaganda make in the face of actual truth you can disseminate virally. I mean,
yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think it's correct to think about a lot of these claims like within the context of international arms trade. I think that's absolutely true. And I think also, I mean, this is something again we touched upon briefly the last time we talked in relation to the work of Foucault and Deleuze, but there's I mean, one of the central functions of surveillance is not actually the collection of data, but it's about the production of a particular kind of subjectivity, right? Like they want you to show up at the airport interrogation terrified and ready to kind of divulge everything and etc. And that's the function of it, right? And I mean, the art, we could talk about the architecture of these airport rooms and stuff. I mean, it's like all kind of constructed to terrify you in a particular way, but it's absurd, I mean, just to share another vignette, which is kind of just to kind of make it clear. Like I mentioned, I kind of went in and out of the country on totally kind of transparent terms, right? Because I felt like that was the way that I can ensure that I can continue teaching, which is the purpose that I went for, right? So every time I would go, they would ask me what I was doing. I said I lived in the West Bank and taught at university, and this would initiate long interrogations, right? But there was one time where a member of my partner's family was visiting, and we ended up flying out with them, and they didn't speak English; they only spoke Spanish. This family member. And so we kind of approached the border checkpoint, and instead of just defaulting to English, like we started speaking Spanish, right? And so they kind of shuffled us off to another kind of person who was doing interrogating, who also spoke Spanish. And then we got the friendliest kind of conversation in Spanish about, oh, did you enjoy your visit, and da 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 da. But it was just like this slight subjective shift, right? Of like, oh, these people aren't speaking English, they're like Spanish tourists or something. Whereas I mean, obviously they had all this data about me, right? And they knew where I lived, and they'd given me permits and the whole thing. But suddenly this small subjective shift in the register kind of, I don't know, caught them off guard or whatever. And just kind of disrupted the whole apparatus of interrogation and everything else. So this fantasy of it being kind of total and just impermeable is just, I mean, it's absurd, right?
So one thing that I find really interesting and heart-wrenching and disgusting is the way in which this fantasy that you've described, where the occupation has to be both omnipresent and completely porous and perforated, meanwhile, omniscient and also completely in the dark. I think it presents a particular kind of dual play where we in the West, in this sort of comfortable disposition where this is something that we have to consume even in anger and rage, is in some ways the complete refinement of really total mobilization. Like the absolutely unacceptable and disturbing series of absolutely grotesque actions that have led to the deaths of dozens of people just with the dropping of one piece of ordnance. The justification is that there was one person there. And Hamas, speaking for the Al-Qassam Brigade, says, no, he wasn't. But it doesn't matter, because here in the West, this paradigm of risk is precisely what we operate on. So this fantasy that you describe has sort of been the norm, maybe since World War I, but especially since the dropping of nuclear weapons, where entire populations have to be put at stake, entire populations have to be mobilized, and in a certain way, part of what is unbearable is that it's becoming increasingly obvious, I think, to people who aren't even adequately exposed, whether you want to call it radicalized or not, because I don't think one ought to need to be in order to feel this way, is that the way in which we live, even if we detest it, um, you described it as quotidian. Our quotidian processes are only upheld in as much as this is exported to another part of the world. So long as this is the norm for colonized people, but specifically for Palestine, um, the day-to-day processes of the Western world continue. And I'm wondering, because in your piece, you speak of a kind of epistemic problem where we in the imperial core, we can't imagine we don't think about what a free Palestine looks like. We can't. But I would say that those who are in revolt and under the absolute subjugation of this occupying force, they know precisely what this looks like. They live in every single instance that possibility of a free Palestine. And you see it just in the remarkable sort of strength and endurance. But it's us that can't, because this has been the very way that we live our life is the thing that upholds this. It's not just a series of grotesque actions. It's not just transgressions that we make against the subjugated. It's precisely the condition of possibility for the StreamYard system that we're on right now that makes this possible. So in a sense, yes, all the world's eyes are on Palestine, but ultimately, I think the reason why this is the historic moment is because it is a culminating point for precisely the entire security apparatus that we have lived under. And that the ruling class, whatever you want to call it, but because us too, that we have prospered under, has come to this sickening and intolerable reality that we've just let fester. So I just want to talk about, like, what does it mean when you speak of this kind of virtuality of a free Palestine that is separated from the statistical abstraction where we could speak of 10,000 being dead and not absolutely collapse? Like, what does a transgression against abstraction look like for us who are in the imperial core and know only this abstraction? We live this abstraction. This is our life.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would respond in two ways. To respond to your earlier point, I mean, I think what we see kind of in Israel and Palestine is really kind of the logic of security unfolding, right? The discourse around this being a war, like that Israel is waging against Hamas in Gaza is kind of absurd, right? And I mean, the absurdity or the even kind of unthinkability of a war taking place like emerges in like official discourse, right? That like no one can, not even generals, not Israeli politicians, not the most far right elements of Israeli society can really articulate in any way like what it would mean to defeat Hamas, right? And so if you can't really articulate what it would mean to defeat like an enemy, you're kind of like outside of the logic of war, right? You can, you can't, it's not like a conflict between two parties, right? And it's rather the logic of security about this kind of desire to impose a particular kind of order, which as that desire grows more totalizing and more consuming and really kind of epistemologically shapes how you kind of see the world. Of course, that's kind of accompanied by a magnification of insecurity, right? The more you kind of zoom in and hone in on every kind of civilian and every worker and every migrant and whatever as a potential terrorist, as a potential person that will revolt against society, you suddenly find yourself entirely encompassed and surrounded, right? And this is often talked about in a very abstract way, but in Palestine it happens like in these super literal, even architectural ways, right? It's like settlers like move into the West Bank. They build their outposts like on top of a mountain. They like build walls around it, put movement sensors and blah blah blah, arm themselves to the teeth, and then they're surprised that they're like surrounded by the enemy. I mean, it's just like the logic of it is so extreme that it's kind of breathtaking. It exceeds kind of the capacity to really understand it in some ways. And so when you end up in a situation where the desire is to entirely control the situation, which is kind of coupled with the realization that the situation is entirely out of your control, it produces these extreme forms of violence and kind of that we're seeing, right? That of course, if the enemy is everywhere and is always threatening to encroach, the only response is like total bombardment, right? I mean, it's just like total eradication, because what's the alternative, right? In the context of that kind of fantasy. This is what I try to get at with kind of rethinking the concept of genocide within the piece, is that it's precisely, I think, linked to this abstraction, right? This idea of kind of abstracting the enemy kind of produces the conditions under which you can eradicate what's abstracted, right? It's when you get kind of abstracted and kind of identified and individuated in a particular kind of security regime, that is what kind of opens life to this particular kind of abstract violence. The second part, that you're raising, I think is the more complicated part, and I think we could probably spend the rest of the time talking about it. But I think it has to do with the ways in which contemporary sovereignty and also the security apparatus, and again in Israel, I think this is one of the most extreme places this is happening, but where there's a kind of symmetry, like a formal symmetry that's imposed upon all of life, right? That there's the state and the hostess, that there's the citizen and the terrorist, etc. And so you have this kind of abstract this or that, which kind of codes and inscribes itself upon all of life. And so when you end up in this kind of situation, the concept of Palestine, let alone the kind of concept of a free Palestine, is entirely lost, like within the colonial abstraction, right? Because all Palestine, the remainder of kind of what Palestine is in the piece, I kind of describe it as a kind of shadow of the occupation, right? It's not a Palestine that is something in itself, or that has a kind of autonomous existence, but it's rather an Israeli Palestine, right? And I think that's one of the central things that has to be kind of exploded and kind of detonated in this situation if there's going to be any other kind of future that's beyond the kind of perpetual conflict and occupation and genocide which is occurring, right? There have been a few things that have kind of come up in this really desolating period of the past few weeks that have kind of shown a light into a space beyond the kind of symmetry of the abstraction, right? Where it's just kind of this or that in the singular kind of image. There's this kind of profound moment where some of the hostages that were being held in Gaza, released a video statement. and they kind of demanded of the Israeli state that there be a trade, right, of everyone for everyone was the context, was the phrase they used, right? We want a trade of everyone for everyone, kind of within the framework of this kind of exchange of Palestinian prisoners and hostages, which has occurred, many times over the history of the occupation. But the phrasing of everyone for everyone, it's such a particular kind of formulation, right? And it kind of explodes the categories in this really beautiful ethical way, right? It's precisely about not letting your thought or your life kind of fall into this binary distinction of this or that, and it's about a kind of everyone kind of emerging outside of that, which is not reducible to the abstraction that's kind of facilitating the violence, right? Another example that I saw, which really struck me, was on X or Twitter or whatever. You see all these. There's this kind of genre of tweet that's emerged during the recent assault in Gaza, where it's kind of like the last tweet, right? Where you see like Gazans saying like, I'm not sure like if I'll be alive after the next blackout. Like this might be the last tweet. Don't forget me, right? This is incredibly tragic. Kind of last expression, last kind of plea. And there was one account that was tweeting, that if they died in the next round of bombing, right, they didn't want to be remembered as like like a number, right? They didn't want to be remembered as like a casualty. They didn't want to be remembered as like as just one more kind of entry in the data sheet or whatever. But they use this other, again, like really, really profound turn of phrase where they said, like, I'm a whole planet, right? This phrasing of like I am not like even an individual life, or I am not like a life, that's particularly valuable for X or Y reason. I'm not like an innocent life or a guilty life, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a whole planet, right? It's like this plea towards kind of the multiplicity and infinity of life, which I think, and the commonality of life, right? That is just so profound. And so you see these kind of tiny moments where the whole abstract apparatus, the whole symmetry of the situation cracks apart and folds. And I think that is precisely that, right? That offers us a glimpse of what a free Palestine looks like. I'll stop there because I could keep going, but yeah.
Sure, we're firmly talking about your piece in Ill Will right now, and I think your analysis here is quite important. This distinction that we're making between the epistemologies of cybernetics being juxtaposed to life and the emergence of new forms of life. There's a beautiful sentence, I think, that sort of lays out the basis of your theory right in the middle of your piece. It says, it's on the basis of life's abstraction that lives can be so carelessly and effortlessly substituted by lists of their predicates, through which a life can be computed, contemplated, and potentially culled as if it were simply a set of its discrete and described properties. And one of the things that I ruminated on while I was reading is, the pace of the news cycle and everything is escalating day by day. And perhaps even since you had written this piece, maybe we are, much further out than, both philosophically and mentally and emotionally than perhaps you were in the moment that you wrote this piece, I'm imagining. I'm wondering, what are some of the ways in which this abstraction has unfolded as the genocide has unfolded? I mean, I certainly had an insight recently when I heard someone online, I think it was either in a news report or perhaps it was a tweet, where they said Palestinians are the only people who have to prove that they are no longer alive. And what I thought was interesting about that, or horrifying actually, juxtaposed against this concept that these abstractions are like a cold blanket that smothers life, is that in the midst of one's death, by the hands of a genocidal regime, that one's death is not recorded or registered as such unless it can be adequately mediatized. And so I thought that was, just a terrifying way to think about one's death. I mean, that's definitely evident in the examples that you and Will had both mentioned. But do you perhaps see other ways in which the terror of the abstraction has unfolded?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I'm kind of writing about now, so I don't want to get too into it, but I don't want to go too astray. So I'll try to stay close to the ill will piece. But I think what you're kind of bringing up and identifying is this, particularly with the case of kind of having to prove prove your own death, right? I mean, that I think is such a crystal clear example of the kind of abstract violence which is kind of bearing down on everyone in Gaza right now. That the whole thing about the hospital bombing and the whole kind of visual investigation that followed in the days afterwards, right? I mean, it speaks to the ways in which the symbolic and the kind of the digital kind of overwrite all forms of kind of ethical concern, right? That it's not enough to actually claim a particular kind of ethical understanding of what's going on in the situation, but instead it gets kind of fragmented and exploded apart into a million different individual instances of violence that have to be verified and circulated and counted and documented, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as a way of kind of refusing to think of death and violence at all, right? I mean, um, thinking about the ways death is kind of simulated and recreated as a form of kind of political claim, again, I think just kind of exposes the sheer kind of poverty of the way in which the conflict is being thought about. That if you have to appeal to like the whole rise of what is it called, open source intelligence, right? Which is this kind of like whole genre of discourse online now about collecting videos and photos and tweets and blah blah maps and blah 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 as a way of kind of discerning what actually happened in particular kind of situations. It reduces the whole kind of ethical relation to the world into a kind of juridical one, where you're kind of claiming true or false in any given situation, which is just a way of kind of refusing to have an ethical relationship to the world, right? And so, yeah, that's incredibly troubling. And yeah, I mean, it really reveals, again, I think, the poverty. I think that's the perfect word, the poverty of the ways that in which the conflict is being thought about, because it doesn't lead you anywhere but back to back to the kind of violence and that's occurring. It's a kind of very circular kind of logic where you just kind of are constantly trying to confirm what's very obviously happening. And I'm not going to say anyone's name, but I mean, there's also like this whole genre of like academic and activists who like describe the situation as complex, and they don't want to take a side, and everyone's killing each other, and don't rush in and take sides, and this whole thing. And that's a similar kind of exercise, right? It's like focusing on the kind of digitality of the situation, kind of dividing it into a million different points of violence that you then have to kind of adjudicate and sort and weigh and balance, is just a refusal to see the very clear, obvious kind of ethical distinction between kind of oppressor and oppressed in the situation. And so, yeah, that's like, I think, one of the ways in which the abstraction is really curtailing the ability to have a kind of real relationship to what's going on. The second thing is that, I think part of the kind of Israeli military strategy and the kind of strategy of the state is really bound up in this kind of mediatized abstraction of the conflict. So as we kind of already talked about, Israel is really invested in kind of demonstrating the kind of total power of the military apparatus. And so you see like all of the bombing and the aerial videos of the bombing and the inviting reporters to go visit the stationed soldiers on the edges of Gaza that have kind of begun the ground invasion in Gaza. And so there's this whole kind of production of kind of like, look at our violence, right? Look at our weaponry, look at our soldiers, they're so manly and muscular, and they're all ready to do this, they're so brave, etc. So they want to really display like themselves as the kind of pure image of kind of sovereign violence and really assert themselves in this way. And then at the same time, they want to completely deny and erase Palestinian suffering and death, right? To the point where you have all these Israeli social media kind of influencer people who do all these kind of visual analyses of bombing sites and hospital images and things like this, and kind of create these posts about, oh, they call it like Pallywood, right? These are like fake deaths. These are people that have died 5 times over the past decade. Look, it's the same person with the same blood on their face, blah, blah, blah. So again, these are like facts that cannot coexist, right? It's like, you cannot be the most powerful, violent, dominating military in the world that is entirely kind of controlling and imposing itself upon a situation, and like not cause any suffering and death, right? These are like two things that cannot coexist in reality, but nonetheless, like in the realm of abstraction, are like totally congruent and complementary. And so I think that's exactly the kind of operations that work. And we could go on to talk about the discourse of it, because of course the abstraction is like absolutely clear, and the discursive side of it as well. The whole constant demand that everyone condemn Hamas is one kind of element of this abstraction, where a particular kind of category or political formation becomes a kind of marker or container for kind of the whole culpability of all the violence that's occurring. This whole conversation, which has been going on for as long as I can remember, this whole question of like, does Israel have the right to exist? I mean, this is like it's a kind of nonsensical question. Like, states do not have like rights. No, I mean, this is like historically, like, again, it's like nonsensical, but it becomes like discursively kind of totalizing, right? Because if you're not able to kind of like provide a clear affirmative answer to that question, then you're like completely kind of expunged from the realm of kind of acceptability, and again, within this kind of abstract apparatus, considered like synonymous with a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer or something like this, right? So again, I can go on and on with many different examples, but I think, yeah, like getting out of this kind of abstraction, which flows so heavily and kind of densely online and on television and in news and in parliaments and everything else, is incredibly difficult. But I think that's the task we have before us. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the conclusions we can draw from what you just said is that those who are under the spell of the quote unquote complexity narrative, if they were to have that illusion lifted from them, they would be forced to encounter this question of a state's legitimacy and its self-establishing legitimacy, which I think, meditating on that and pondering that, is, in itself radicalizing, and it gets you to see, past the sort of haze of these phantasms that are out there, that occlude, like what's happening under, the Zionist regime, imperial oppression, whatever we want to call it. With that said, I want to go back to Adam and Will before we close out the episode.
Can I make one more point?
Absolutely.
There's this, just to be like incredibly clear about this, there's this phrase, from the river to the sea, right? That's used in most, if not all, kind of protests and solidarity with Palestine, right? And this is always condemned as a kind of call to eradicate Jewish life in Israel, right? And this kind of circulation and interpretation and conceptual kind of abstract frame, which is kind of like coded onto that phrase, I think is the precise like impasse that we need to kind of eradicate and destroy, right? I mean, I think if you cannot comprehend like a territory between the river and the sea, right, where presently in Gaza, the West Bank, and the state of Israel, exist, if you cannot comprehend that territory being a space within which kind of Jewish life and Arab life can kind of coexist without the, a kind of apartheid state, then you're just, you're essentially positioning yourself in a perpetual situation of the kind of present violence. You're never going to be able to escape or think beyond the kind of the violence that just circulates so thoroughly through the present, and like this is something that Edward Said was like very clear about, right? That you cannot like think of a future of like Jerusalem or the present territory that's controlled with Israel that does not involve like Jewish and Arab and Palestinian and Muslim life. I mean, all of the people that live there, their futures are kind of bound together. Imagining a future where you expel Jews from that territory would involve a scale of violence that's just unimaginable and unjustifiable. And so being able to understand, that claim of like, we want Palestine to be free, like from the river to the sea, is precisely again about like the claim for a form of life which is not reducible to these kind of oppositional abstractions and these forms of violence, which you know quite on a conceptual level and an epistemological level and a political level, like literally oppose people, A and B, like in a symmetrical fashion, right? And so it's about breaking that symmetry, I think, is the key.
And I think from the vantage point of empire, or from the imperial core, or what have you, it's almost as if life without the abstraction is viewed as a kind of abjection or a bewilderment. Actually, our friend Eden from Death Sentence podcast talks about the very bewildering nature of being able to step out from behind this sort of imperialist paradigm and see the possibilities of a life devoid of this epistemological oppression. And I think that's what's hard for them to swallow. And I think that abjection then turns into a kind of projection, which then creates the cyclical violence, both concrete and abstract. But yeah, I want to go to Adam and Will, and then we'll make our way towards finishing up.
Yeah, I'd also like to co-sign the words of Eden from Death Sentence. It's the episode on bewilderment. He speaks of an incredible sort of materialist and moral clarity. But I also want to thank Ian as well, because I was going to ask a question about exactly this chant: from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It is a very contentious issue in Britain at the moment. Well, not contentious. The fascist forces of our government and press are pushing on it. It's not contentious in the slightest. I was with over 500,000 people shouting it. Not contentious in the slightest. If the government had got a problem with it, but fuck the British government, But one of the reasons why it seems so, in a way, contentious for them is because it talks about territory. I wonder if there's a sense in which the abstraction seeps out of simply being used as a colonizing mechanism, because it's almost like, especially in look at terms of the killing of Israeli hostages in Gaza by the indiscriminate, meticulously indiscriminate bombardment, it seems like this abstraction seeps out in a way, in that it reduces. And this is one of the things that makes Zionism so conducive to certain kinds of evangelical and philo-Semitic anti-Semitism, which is it also reduces its subjects to an abstraction. And this is, subsuming into a national essence, and which particular human beings are simply disposable insofar as everyone becomes an abstraction because everyone is the object of the strategy. And I wanted to ask particularly about this, the hostility towards talking about territory as opposed to the map, because, the Zionist project presupposes a pre-existent map of Zion, of Israel, as given through a very biblically literalist meta-narrative, which isn't very theologically literate, hasn't been for ever really. But particularly this idea of the abstraction leaking out, because do you think it would be accurate to talk about, particularly on the level of technology, and technologies are being developed and trained, for example, by micro workers in refugee camps, in the so-called ways in which Elbit battle tests its drones on Palestinians? Is this production of abstraction, this production of strategic weaponries and practices, it does leak, but is what we're seeing now something of a laboratory for things that are already happening? For example, it takes up the UK's border concentration camp system, Frontex in the Mediterranean, and vice versa. Maybe they probably feed back into each other. The border in Spain with Morocco. Do you see this abstraction as inherently transmuting itself all around the globe from these central nodes of control and oppression?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, this is something I haven't written about extensively, but I think there are these really elaborate histories that have been done around the kind of, for example, like circulation of colonial technologies, and this idea of the colony as being an experimental laboratory for particular kind of repressive technologies, which then kind of return to the metropolis, and and the other direction as well. And so yeah, and I mean, I think this is part of the logic of security, right? That we see the kind of world organizing itself into particular kind of blocks, and then in the global north and in North America and Western Europe and Israel, is certainly conceptually and on the level of sovereignty imagine itself as European in a lot of ways. They see themselves as these kinds of fortresses which require defending from increasingly hostile and chaotic world. And this is something I worry about, is that on the US-Mexico border, which we haven't talked about, there's obviously similar kind of brutal forms of violence and death and eradication occurring. And certainly the Mediterranean, I mean, it's that's something I have worked on in the past. And the amount of death and the amount of indifference to death is just kind of staggering. It's become integrated into European sovereignty and Fortress Europe and all these kinds of things. So yeah, absolutely. And again, we won't have time to really parse through it here today, just because it's such a huge conversation. But with climate change and all these kinds of things that will increase the amount of displaced people and impoverished people, we're going to see the logic of kind of needing to manage these kind of unruly populations just multiply and intensify. And this is, again, it's like it's an uncontroversial fact. I mean, like, they're Israeli generals, right, who like obviously are like very integrated into like Israeli sovereignty and the Zionist project and everything, who say like straightforwardly, like doing this to Gaza will not like solve the situation. And in fact, like, this will make it worse. This will produce more like people that are gonna like want to kill us, and etc. Right? This is like a non-controversial like military security fact. But nonetheless, the like logic of the abstraction like overrides the reason of a particular kind of military doctrine in that sense. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, like, in the affirmative entirely. But I mean, to just to return to a more philosophical point, in relation to that, I mean, one of the real dangers of this whole regime is that, we haven't talked about this explicitly, but, one of the ways abstraction functions is like in this objectification, right? It's like through kind of understanding life not as something that's living, but as a kind of collection of its predicates or its descriptive qualities or etc. You come to treat life as a kind of collection or a particular kind of constellation of objects, and then you can kind of do things to those objects as a way of doing things to those lives, right? Which is something I try to explore in the piece. But something I didn't talk about in the piece, just because I didn't want to go on for too long, is that there's a similar effect that happens to the oppressor, right? That in fact, when you begin to see the world as like objects in need of destruction, you kind of become implicated in the objectification yourself, right? You stop living in the world, and instead you kind of have an objectified relationship to the world, right? You in fact become less alive in your inability to kind of like think about other life, And so there's this way in which the objectification circulates as well, right? And you're talking about kind of like leakage, right? It's not just like, oh, the Palestinians are objectified and killed in this manner as part of the abstraction, how horrible. But Israelis are also, like fucked over by this, right? It's not like, being someone who dominates is also to kind of like lessen yourself as a living thing. It's to become trapped in the symmetry where you are incapable of having a real relationship to the world. This is like, I always return to that passage or quote from Fred Moten, where he's talking about the possibility of coalition as a kind of political practice, and he talks about coalition like this idea of like organizing and struggling and fighting politically with people that are different than yourself. He says like the foundation of like all coalition is that like you need to recognize that like what's fucked up for me is like what's fucked up for you too. It's like, it's not just that like there's the oppressor and the oppressed, and the violence is totally going in one direction. Like the violence circulates, and if you can't get to the moment where you can kind of recognize that, then again there's like no way out. You're just like stuck in the symmetry. So yeah, I mean, again, I could like go into the multiplicity of life and all these kind of like alternatives for thinking about what's beyond abstraction. But again, maybe I'll stop there for now and do that somewhere else.
I think that the point that has to be made is that from the river to the sea can only be understood as an eradication of life if you understand the world only through territories of domination, sovereignty, and history as the right to be a vanquisher. So if you take up this interpretation, it does nothing but prove that you falsely believe that you're among the masters of the world, right? And not fully implicated in it. And that's what's deeply disgusting about the condemnation of From the River to the Sea, is that it actually is just a reaffirmation of the way in which this is understood. So I don't think it's even close to a kind of misguided caution or, a sad mistaken understanding by some pensive coward, but is instead a fully thoroughly intentioned affirmation of genocidal intent historically. So I really do think that that is what people in Gaza are up against. And in the sense, that's what we have to understand. When it is Gaza versus the world, it's the entire historicity of what the world has become is landing right on top of the children of Gaza. It's not just that it is the world against these mothers and fathers. It is the entirety of its history that's made it possible, that's made this moment possible. So when we say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that is the promise that this world can be destroyed, and that it must, and that it has to start at the places and in the positions that have been subjected to the pure banishment that these apparatuses have produced. So I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that.
No, I mean, you kind of remind me of this image that again I'm kind of trying to think through now as a kind of, what another Palestine would be, right? Or what is like a place beyond this kind of abstraction. Um, with like Umberto Eco, the Italian, a writer, like he had this massive library, right, of like tens of thousands of books, right? And I forget in what context this conversation came up, but they were, in the conversation they were saying something like when people visited the library, they had like two responses, like one was like, oh my God, how did someone read this much, right? And then the second response was like the people that realized that, of course, like he doesn't read it all, right? Like most of the library is it just there, it's like unread, and then they kind of conceptualize this as like the anti-library, right? Like this library that you kind of build in your life of like all the things that you have not read and will never be able to read, right? And it's I mean, just in a kind of everyday sense, it's a kind of lovely image, right? Like, we're kind of programmed into thinking like it's shameful to kind of like have books that you buy that you never read, right? But there's a real beauty to this image, I think, this idea of having a relation to the world where like in your life you kind of build space for all of those things that you have no knowledge of, right? That you're aware of their existence and you're aware that they are there and are valid alongside the other tomes, but they're beyond your own kind of capacity to map it or understand it or recognize it. And I think this kind of image of the anti-library is like ethically like the grounds for like a different Palestine, right? That when we talk about like a space between the river and the sea that isn't like Israel, then you're talking about something that's kind of beyond the present recognition and delimitation of the territory, right? That is kind of nonsensical within the present partition and kind of organization of the territory. And so, when you can imagine, an Israeli citizen who like thinks that they understand themselves entirely and thinks that they understand Palestinians entirely. And this is like, again, it's like an incredibly impoverished way to live, right? It's this idea that this is, you know, what Deleuze calls like the logic of recognition. You know, it's like it's thinking something again, right? It's like in the process of recognition, you do not actually have a thought, you just repeat the thought that you've already had, right? It's just kind of like a repetition of the form. It's to recognize, right? And if you're stuck in this mode of recognition where everything you see around you, you already know and has already been codified and structured and abstracted, then you've kind of ceased to live in the world, right? And this anti-library, I think, is an image of what a life might be like that refuses such capture, that refuses such epistemological and abstract reduction of life, and might imagine, you know, Jewish and Arab and Palestinian and Muslim, and, you know, like all the radical diversity of life existing in an other form, in other forms of collectivity and belonging that are not reducible to categories as they are already recognizable, which is, I think, the beauty and the kind of hope that we have to hold on to. You know, this idea of living in a world, in a library of which you know nothing about, but you surround yourself with by virtue of recognizing its value regardless. It's, you know, this is again reminiscent, I think, of Glissant's opacity, right? This idea of community and intimacy that isn't premised on recognition or identification.
Well, Ian, before we close out, just a few things. You've sent me on a complete guilt trip right now as I'm walled in by books in the anti library. But that's okay. That's okay. I will get through some of these. I won't get through all of them. Another thing, kind of a non sequitur, but when we were talking about the prospects for New Palestine, I couldn't help but focus on the ambient sound of children playing in the background. I think it's in your feed. And I don't know, it's just a wonderful but unusual coincidence. And I think it's important to notice in these times of strife to find those moments of beauty and uplift, you know, to support ourselves and to support each other. And one more thing, Will and I we actually had, I just wrote down in our group chat the phrase becoming planetary. Well, first I wrote becoming planet. And then that started a micro debate with Will where he didn't like that word, but that's fine. And then I said, what about becoming planetary? And I really like that as a sort of proto concept or a nascent concept of something that can exceed the epistemological predicates, not by shrinking down, but expanding, right? And it's not becoming an ecology, something that's indexed, something that's fully predicated, something that's fully known, you know, for the purpose of utilitarianism, sustainability, that sort of thing. What does it mean to become planetary, to exceed an ecology? So I really appreciate that. Maybe one more question before we go, because a lot of folks who listen to us are grad students, some are philosophy professors, and then all sorts of folks who are interested in all kinds of books and stuff. And we're at a point where, you know, we really need the full support of our philosophical comrades in this. There are people, you know, who are speaking up every day, you know, doing things online, going to the demos, going to the protests and so forth. What at this point would you recommend philosophically that we do in addition to perhaps, you know, more practical action? But, or maybe a better question is, what is the role of the philosopher right now in this crisis as you see it on this date in 2023?
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't think there is a role. I think that's part of the maybe problem is us thinking about what is the thing to do in this situation, right? I mean, I think what we can do is that we should find ourselves wherever we are, wherever we live, whatever context we live our lives within, and struggle to find other people in those situations that also have a desire to kind of transform and revolt against the world as it presently exists. And I think it's going to look very different in many different kinds of places. And I think I would never tell someone else in another situation how they should organize or resist, just because I know in my life, like, it's meant very different things at very different points in my life. So I think the philosophical thing, the political thing to do now is to get with other people and think with other people and refuse the kind of, individuation and privation that is so common now, of kind of like everyone having their own take and like little insight about the situation. And in the context of Gaza, obviously, where the vast majority of us are not there, understanding how all of the systems and all of the kind of infrastructures and all the processes of violence are as Adam kind of noted, they circulate, and they have ties all over the world. If you do preliminary research in where you live, you're going to find like people that are really obviously kind of implicated in these forms of violence. And so I think only when we're allowed to kind of like organize and think and imagine kind of in all of these different contexts and all the diverse ways in which that looks, might we arrive at a place where we can actually kind of transform the situation. So, beyond the symbolic stuff that's happening is of course very important. I mean, I think it's really great that everyone's out and kind of making it clear that this is unacceptable and expressing themselves in that way. But of course, I think if we meaningfully mean to intervene and kind of destroy these kind of machines of desolation, it's going to involve a different scale and intensity of organizing that's going to, again, it's going to look very different in a different context. So that's my kind of non-advice advice, I guess.
But very good advice. Ian, I want to thank you again. We really look forward to getting your manuscript out, The Reticular Society, on Zero Books, probably sometime next year. It's to be determined when that will happen, but thanks again for coming on the show.
Yeah, it was really great to think with you all. Thanks again.
All right, take care.